Close your eyes for a moment and imagine this. You've been riding since dawn, your body aching from hours in the saddle, dust coating every inch of your skin. The sun has finally dipped below the horizon, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and purple. Now comes the question that every traveler on the frontier had to answer each and every night. Where will you sleep? And more importantly, how will you survive until morning? Before we begin this journey into the sleeping habits of the Old West, I want you to get comfortable. Adjust your pillow, settle into your blankets, and let the stress of your day fade away. Tonight, we're going back to a time when sleep wasn't guaranteed, when every night was an exercise in survival, and when the difference between waking up refreshed or not waking up at all often came down to knowledge passed from one generation to the next. There's something deeply calming about understanding how people lived in the past, how they solved problems we never have to think about anymore. So take a deep breath, let your shoulders relax, and allow yourself to drift back to the 1800s, to a time when the American West was still being written, one campfire at a time. The stories you're about to hear aren't myths or Hollywood fantasies. They're the real methods, the actual techniques that cowboys, pioneers, prospectors, and native peoples used to find rest in a land that seemed determined to prevent it. And as you listen, you might find that the rhythm of these old survival strategies, the careful preparation, the attention to detail, the respect for the land carries its own kind of peace. So dim the lights if you haven't already. Get as comfortable as you can, and let's step back in time together to discover what it really meant to sleep under the stars in the brutal, beautiful, unforgiving Wild West. Chapter 1. Reading the land before sunset, long before a cowboy, prospector, or pioneer family even thought about unrolling a bedroll. They had to master the first and most critical skill of frontier sleep, choosing where to lay their head. In the Wild West, this wasn't a matter of convenience or comfort. It was a matter of life and death. The land itself spoke to those who knew how to listen. An experienced drover could read the subtle signs of terrain the way a scholar reads a book, understanding that every slope, every cluster of rocks, every bend in a dry creek bed carried information about what the night might bring. Water was always the first consideration, but not in the way you might think. Yes, a camp needed to be near water for drinking, cooking, and washing. But too close to water meant danger. Rivers and streams were highways for predators. Mountain lions, bears, and wolves all followed water sources, hunting the deer, elk, and smaller game that came to drink at dusk and dawn. A camp placed right at the water's edge was like setting up in the middle of a predator's dining room. The smart camper positioned himself 100 yards or more from the water, close enough to fetch it without exhausting effort, far enough to avoid becoming part of the local food chain. This distance also helped with another problem: insects. Mosquitoes, gnats, and biting flies congregated near water in clouds so thick they could drive horses mad and leave a sleeping man covered in welts by morning. But distance from water was just the beginning. The ground itself had to be evaluated with a careful eye. Soft sand might seem inviting after a day in the saddle, but sand was cold, impossibly cold, once the sun went down. The desert could swing from 100-degree fire in the afternoon to near freezing after midnight, and sand held no heat whatsoever. Experienced travelers looked for slightly elevated ground with a harder surface, places where the earth had been packed down by animal traffic, or where a thin layer of clay lay beneath the surface. Low spots were to be avoided at all costs. Even in the driest months, a flash flood could roar down a canyon with no warning, turning a peaceful sleeping spot into a death trap in minutes. The old saying among frontiersmen was clear: if you can see the watermarks on the rocks, sleep somewhere higher. Flash floods in the Southwest could transform a bone-dry wash into a raging torrent in less time than it took to saddle a horse. Beyond flooding, low ground had another problem. Cold air, like water, flows downhill. On clear nights, when the temperature plummeted, the coldest air in any area would settle into the valleys and depressions. A sleeping spot just 10 feet higher could be noticeably warmer, the difference between sleeping soundly and shivering until dawn. Wind was the next factor. The constant wind of the plains, the sudden gusts that funneled through mountain passes, the unpredictable dust devils of the desert, all of these had to be considered. A camp needed protection from prevailing winds, but not complete enclosure. Too much shelter, such as a narrow canyon or a dense thicket, could trap a traveler if trouble came. The ideal spot offered a natural windbreak, a rock outcropping, a stand of trees, or a rise in the land. That blocked the worst of the wind while still allowing a clear view of the surroundings and easy escape if needed. Trees, when available, were both blessing and curse. They offered shade during the day, fuel for fires, and some protection from wind and rain. But they also harbored dangers. Dead branches could fall without warning, especially on windy nights, crushing a sleeping man beneath them. The frontier called these widowmakers, and experienced outdoorsmen checked the trees above their sleeping spot as carefully as a miner checked the ceiling of a shaft. Certain trees were avoided entirely after dark. Cottonwoods, with their brittle branches, were notorious for dropping limbs. Dead standing timber, no matter how solid it appeared, could topple in a strong gust. And in lightning country, the tallest tree in any area was an invitation to disaster. Many a traveler learned too late that the shelter of a solitary oak or pine in a thunderstorm was more dangerous than sleeping in the open. The direction a camp faced mattered too. In winter, a south-facing camp caught more sun throughout the day and stayed warmer at night. The rocky face of a cliff or large boulder that had absorbed sunlight all afternoon would radiate that heat back through the evening, creating a natural warming system that could add precious degrees to the sleeping temperature. Cowboys on winter cattle drives learned to position their bedrolls against these sun-warmed rocks, using them as a heat sink that worked through the coldest hours before dawn. In summer, the equation reversed. A camp needed shade, needed to be positioned where the midday sun couldn't turn the sleeping area into an oven. Desert travelers learned to look for camps on the east side of rock formations, where the afternoon sun would be blocked, allowing the area to cool before sleep time arrived. Animal signs were read like a newspaper. Fresh predator tracks meant moving on. Disturbed ground where a bear had been digging for grubs suggested finding another spot. Circles of flattened grass where deer had bedded down indicated a place relatively free of danger, as deer wouldn't sleep where they felt threatened. Snake holes, especially in rocky areas, required careful inspection. A sleeping man who rolled over onto a rattlesnake rarely got a chance to tell the tale. Even the plants held information. Certain types of grass indicated soil that would be relatively dry. Willows and other water-loving plants marked areas that might be boggy after dark when dew fell heavily or when underground springs seeped to the surface. Poison oak and poison ivy had to be identified and avoided, as the oils from these plants could transfer to blankets and clothing, causing days of miserable itching. The presence of fuel for a fire was another consideration. A camp without firewood meant a cold night, and in much of the West, especially the high plains and desert regions, wood was scarce. Travelers learned to identify which plants burned well and which didn't. Sagebrush made a hot, fast fire but burned out quickly, requiring constant feeding. Mesquite burned slow and hot, ideal for long nights. Buffalo chips, the dried dung of the great herds that once covered the plains, burned surprisingly well and were often the only fuel available for hundreds of miles. But fuel gathering had to be balanced against safety. Wandering too far from camp in fading light to collect wood was a good way to get lost, injured, or worse. The smart campers stopped with enough daylight remaining to gather what was needed and get the fire started before full darkness arrived. Drainage was critical, especially in country where sudden storms were common. The ground needed to slope slightly, enough to shed water if rain came in the night, but not so steeply that a sleeping man might roll downhill. Flash floods weren't the only water danger. A level campsite in heavy rain could become a shallow lake, soaking blankets and clothing, stealing body heat, and turning what should have been a restful night into a fight against hypothermia. The social dynamics of the frontier also influenced camp placement. A lone traveler had different needs than a group. Solitary sleepers often chose spots that were partially hidden, where they couldn't be seen from a distance by potential troublemakers. But they also needed sight lines, ways to see approaching danger before it arrived. This often meant camping on slight rises where trees or rocks provided some concealment but didn't block the view entirely. Groups had their own considerations. Large parties needed flat ground for multiple bedrolls and space for horses or wagons. They wanted to be visible to each other, but not to outsiders. The old wagon trains learned to circle their wagons not just for defense, but to create a defined sleeping area that could be watched from all sides. Weather prediction played into camp selection too. Those who traveled the West for long learned to read the sky, to recognize the subtle signs that a storm was building. A ring around the moon suggested rain within a day. Certain cloud formations meant thunderstorms. A sudden drop in temperature at sunset warned of a cold front moving in. When these signs appeared, camps were chosen with extra care, placed where natural shelter would provide protection when the storm arrived. The time of year changed everything. Spring camps needed to account for flooding from snowmelt. Summer camps required protection from the brutal afternoon sun. Fall camps were positioned to block the first cold winds from the north. Winter camps, when travel was possible at all, demanded southern exposures, wind protection, and proximity to both water and fuel. Experience taught lessons that books never could. Veterans of the frontier developed an almost instinctive sense for good camping spots, their eyes scanning the landscape automatically as the day waned. Weighing factors faster than conscious thought could name them. They knew that the flat, inviting meadow might be home to ticks and chiggers, that the picturesque spot beside the rushing stream would be too loud to hear approaching danger, that the grove of trees that looked perfect might be full of biting ants once you settled in for the night. But for all the careful evaluation, sometimes perfection wasn't available. Sometimes darkness fell before an ideal spot could be found. Sometimes injury, exhaustion, or pursuing danger forced a camp in less than ideal conditions. When that happened, the experienced frontiersman knew how to make the best of a bad situation, using every trick at his disposal to maximize safety and rest despite the circumstances. As the sun touched the western horizon and the decision had to be made, the traveler's choice of sleeping spot became the foundation for everything that followed. A good spot chosen with care could mean the difference between waking refreshed and ready for another day's travel, or waking cold, wet, and miserable if you woke at all. And once that spot was chosen, once the decision was made to stop here, to rest here, to trust this piece of ground with your sleeping hours, then the real work of preparing for the frontier night could begin. Chapter 2. The Bedroll. More than just a blanket. If you asked a cowboy what his most important possession was, he might joke about his horse or his gun. But if he was honest, if he really thought about what kept him alive day after day, mile after mile, he'd point to his bedroll. The bedroll wasn't just where a man slept. It was his portable home, his insurance policy, his survival kit, all rolled into one. A good bedroll, properly made and carefully maintained, could mean the difference between arriving at the next town healthy and capable, or arriving broken, exhausted, and sick from exposure. At its most basic, a bedroll consisted of blankets, but even calling them just blankets misses the sophistication of the system. The typical working cowboy's bedroll contained layers, each serving a specific purpose, arranged in an order that had been perfected through hard experience. The foundation layer, the one that went directly on the ground, was usually canvas, oilcloth, or treated leather. This wasn't for comfort. It was for protection, a barrier between the sleeper and the moisture, cold, and countless small creatures that lived in the earth. Canvas was favored because it was tough, relatively lightweight, and when properly treated with linseed oil or paraffin wax, it shed water reasonably well. This ground layer had to be large enough to fold over the top of the bedroll too, creating a complete envelope that sealed out rain, dew, and wind. A 7 by 8 foot piece of canvas, called a tarp by those who used it, became standard. This was big enough to wrap around blankets and a sleeping man with enough overlap to tuck under the body, preventing drafts from sneaking in at the edges. Over this weather barrier came the insulation layers, and here is where the real art of the bedroll came into play. Wool was king in the frontier West, and for good reason. Wool, unlike cotton, retained most of its insulating properties even when damp. A wool blanket could get wet from sweat, rain, or dew, and still keep a man warm through the night. Cotton killed. That was the saying, and it was true. A wet cotton blanket pulled heat from the body faster than sleeping with nothing at all. The classic cowboy bedroll typically contained 2 to 4 wool blankets, depending on the season and the man's tolerance for cold. These weren't the thin decorative blankets we think of today. They were thick, heavy blankets, often weighing 5 or 6 pounds each, woven tightly enough to block wind, but with enough loft to trap body heat. Color mattered, though not in ways you might expect. Darker blankets absorbed and held heat from the sun during the day, making them warmer at night. But they also showed dirt less, an important consideration when your bedding went months between proper washings. The classic cowboy blanket was often striped or plaid, not for fashion, but because the patterns helped hide the inevitable stains of trail life. The blankets weren't just thrown down randomly, they were layered with thought. The bottom blanket or two served as mattress, providing cushioning against rocks and roots. The top blanket or two served as covering. In cold weather, a man slept between all the layers, creating a cocoon of wool that trapped body heat while blocking external cold. But wool blankets alone weren't enough for the coldest nights. This is where additional tricks came into play, and where the differences between an experienced frontiersman and a greenhorn became obvious. Many. Cowboys carried a hot roll, which wasn't a bedroll at all, but a quilted covering made by their mothers, wives, or sweethearts before they left for the trail. These quilts, stuffed with cotton batting, down, or even raw wool, added critical insulation. They were cherished possessions, carefully maintained and often the only soft reminder of home a man carried with him. For those without quilts, other materials filled the gap. Buffalo robes, before the great herds were decimated, provided unmatched warmth. A single buffalo hide with the fur intact could keep a man comfortable in temperatures that would kill him with wool blankets alone. The thick fur trapped air in countless tiny pockets, creating insulation that rivaled anything nature had produced. When the buffalo vanished, their robes became precious heirlooms, passed down through families and worth more than a month's wages. Bear hides served a similar function for mountain men and trappers, though they were heavier and harder to manage than buffalo robes. Elk, deer, and even cattle hides were used, though cattle leather lacked the dense underfur that made wild animal hides so effective. The arrangement of these layers followed a logic that had been proven across thousands of nights. Hardest, most water-resistant layer on the bottom, softest, warmest layers in the middle, a final protective layer on top that could shed rain or snow if needed. The entire assembly could be rolled tight, tied with leather thongs or rope, and strapped behind a saddle or stowed in a wagon. A properly rolled bedroll was a work of art. It had to be tight enough not to come undone during travel, but not so tight that it creased or damaged the materials inside. It had to be balanced so it didn't shift awkwardly when tied to a saddle. It had to be accessible, able to be unrolled and set up quickly when exhaustion or darkness or weather demanded immediate shelter. The weight of a full bedroll could be substantial, anywhere from 20 to 40 pounds, depending on how many layers a man carried. This was no small burden for a horse already carrying a rider, saddle, saddlebags, weapons, and supplies. The decision of what to include and what to leave behind was a constant calculation, balancing comfort against practicality. In summer, some of the heavier layers might be left at a ranch or base camp, reducing the load. In winter, every ounce of insulation was kept, even if it meant leaving other items behind. A cowboy might go without extra ammunition or spare clothes, but he wouldn't go without enough blankets to see him through a cold night. Maintenance of the bedroll was a never-ending task. Every chance to air out blankets was taken because damp wool lost much of its warming power. On sunny days, bedrolls were unrolled and spread over bushes or fence rails, allowing the sun to dry accumulated moisture and its heat to kill any insects that had taken up residence, because insects were another challenge. Fleas, lice, bedbugs, and ticks all found bedrolls to be ideal homes, warm, dark, and close to a food source. Experienced travelers learned to check their bedding regularly, shaking out blankets, inspecting seams, and treating infestations before they became unmanageable. Some men sprinkled their bedrolls with sulfur powder, a practice that helped discourage bugs, though it made the blankets smell like matches. Tears and holes had to be mended immediately. A rip in the outer canvas layer could let in rain, soaking everything inside. A hole in a wool blanket might seem minor, but cold air pouring through even a small gap could make a night miserable. Most cowboys carried a basic repair kit: heavy thread, a leather needle, and perhaps a patch or two of canvas, ready to fix damage before it became critical. The bedroll's design also had to account for another factor: speed of deployment. When a cowboy finally stopped for the night, usually exhausted from 12 or 14 hours of work, he needed to be able to set up his bed quickly. The roll had to unfurl smoothly, the layers falling into place without tangling or twisting. This meant everything had to be rolled up in the morning in exactly the right order, a discipline that became second nature to those who lived on the trail. Some cowboys developed elaborate systems, tying different colored strings at key points in the roll so they could find specific blankets in the dark. Others marked their canvas layers with distinctive patterns or burns, allowing them to identify top from bottom by feel alone. These small refinements could save minutes when setting up camp, minutes that might be better spent gathering firewood, tending horses, or cooking a meal before full darkness fell. The bedroll was also a man's luggage. Extra clothes, if he had any, might be rolled inside. A spare pair of socks, a change of shirt, perhaps a treasured photograph or letter from home, all could be tucked into the layers where they'd stay dry and protected. Some men used their bedrolls to carry valuables, knowing that a thief would have to wake them to steal their blankets, whereas a saddlebag could be rifled in silence. There were regional variations in bedroll design. Texas cowboys might favor lighter cotton canvas for their ground layer, as the warmer southern climate made heavy oilcloth unnecessary. Montana drovers often added extra wool layers and preferred darker colors that absorbed more heat during the brief summer sun. Desert travelers in Arizona and New Mexico sometimes carried lighter bedrolls but compensated with heavier clothing, as the extreme temperature swings required different strategies. The bedroll also played a role in the social hierarchy of the frontier. A new hand with a skimpy, poorly made bedroll marked himself as inexperienced or poor, neither quality that inspired confidence. A well-made bedroll, thick with quality blankets and showing signs of careful maintenance, suggested a man who knew what he was doing, who planned ahead, who understood that survival in the West required attention to detail. Among native peoples who interacted with or adopted aspects of cowboy culture, bedrolls were adapted to incorporate traditional materials. Deerskin might replace canvas. Hand-woven blankets created using techniques passed down through generations added both warmth and cultural identity. These hybrid bedrolls represented the blending of knowledge systems, taking the best of both worlds to create something suited to the specific needs of the user. As night fell, and the time came to unroll the bedding, the cowboys' movements were practiced, almost ritualistic. First, the ground was cleared of obvious rocks, sticks, and anything else that might press uncomfortably into the back during the night. Then the canvas layer was spread, inspected for holes or moisture. The wool blankets came next, shaken out thoroughly to fluff the fibers and remove any insects or debris. If conditions were dry, the blankets might be laid flat. If rain threatened, they'd be arranged so the canvas could be folded over them quickly. The sleeping position was considered carefully. Most men slept with their heads pointed away from the fire, as sparks and smoke had a way of drifting toward whatever you least wanted them near. The bedroll was positioned so a man could see the approaches to camp without having to turn his head much, allowing him to check for danger without fully waking. In groups, Bedrolls were arranged spoke-like around the fire, heads inward, feet pointing out. This put every man within the circle of firelight, while keeping the warmth concentrated in the center. It also meant everyone could communicate in low voices without shouting, important for night watches and for responding to danger as a group. As the cowboy settled into his bedroll for the night, pulling the canvas edges up and tucking them under his body to seal out drafts, folding a blanket into a rough pillow and arranging the layers just so, he knew he was participating in a ritual as old as human settlement in the West. This bedroll, these layers of wool and canvas, represented generations of trial and error, of men who had frozen, gotten sick, or died because their bedding wasn't adequate, and whose hard lessons had led to improvements that kept subsequent travelers alive. The bedroll was never just a blanket. It was a life support system, a portable shelter, a carefully engineered piece of survival equipment that worked in harmony with the other techniques and tools that allowed humans to not just endure the western frontier, but to make it their home. Chapter 3. Firecraft for the long night. Once the camp was chosen and the bedroll positioned, attention turned to what many considered the heart of frontier survival, the fire. A good fire was more than warmth and light. It was protection, a cooking surface, a social center, and a psychological anchor against the vast darkness of the western night. But making a fire in the Wild West wasn't as simple as striking a match, at least not in the early years. Matches, when available, were precious and unreliable. They got damp. They broke. They ran out at the worst possible times. Every frontiersman worth his salt knew multiple ways to start a fire, because sooner or later he'd find himself with no matches and darkness falling fast. The most reliable method, practiced until it became second nature, was the flint and steel technique. A piece of flint or other hard stone was struck against a piece of steel, creating sparks that fell onto a nest of tinder. The tinder had to be absolutely dry and fine enough to catch from a single spark. Char cloth, cotton, or linen that had been partially burned in an oxygen-starved environment was the gold standard. A single spark on char cloth would create a glowing ember that could be nurtured into flame. Making char cloth required forethought. A piece of cotton fabric was placed in a tin with a small hole punched in it, then heated in a fire until smoke stopped coming out of the hole. What remained was a black papery substance that would glow red-hot from the smallest spark. Cowboys and trappers kept char cloth in small tins, protecting it from moisture like they'd protect gold. The tinder nest was built with equal care. Dry grass, shredded bark, plant down, anything that would catch and burn quickly was shaped into a loose ball about the size of a fist. When the char cloth caught a spark and began to glow, it was placed in the center of the tinder nest, which was then gently blown upon. The art was in the breath, steady and controlled, feeding oxygen to the growing ember without blowing it out. As the tinder burst into flame, it was quickly but carefully transferred to a small pile of kindling. This was another craft in itself. Kindling needed to be small enough to catch from the tinder, but substantial enough to burn long enough to ignite larger fuel. Dry twigs, small sticks, wood shavings, all were gathered and arranged in a loose pyramid that allowed air to flow while keeping the heat concentrated. The fire lay itself could be built in many configurations, each with specific purposes. The most common was the teepee fire, where sticks were leaned against each other in a cone shape, mimicking the lodges that dotted the plains. This design allowed maximum airflow at the base while concentrating heat at the top, perfect for getting a fire started quickly. Once established, the fire might be rebuilt into a log cabin style, with larger pieces of wood laid in alternating layers at right angles. This created a stable platform that burned more slowly and steadily, better for long-term heat and cooking. For warmth through the night, experienced campers built what was called a reflector fire. A large log or stack of logs was positioned on one side of the fire, and the bedroll on the other. As the fire burned, the log acted as a reflector, bouncing heat back toward the sleeping area. This doubled the effect of warmth and could make the difference between a comfortable night and a freezing one. In extremely cold conditions, some frontier sleepers used a variation called a long fire. Instead of a round fire, they built a fire in a trench or between two logs, creating a long, narrow bed of coals. The bedroll was placed parallel to this, close enough to feel the heat, but far enough to be safe. The elongated shape meant more of the body was warmed evenly, rather than having a hot side and a cold side. Fuel selection was critical and varied enormously depending on location. In the wooded regions, oak, hickory, and maple were prized for their long, hot burns. Pine and other softwoods burned fast and threw sparks, useful for starting fires but poor for sustained heat. In the plains, where trees were scarce or non-existent, buffalo chips became the primary fuel. Buffalo chips, for those unfamiliar, were dried buffalo dung. When properly aged and dried by the sun and wind, they burned surprisingly well, with little smell and decent heat output. A large chip could burn for 20 minutes or more, and since the Great Plains were once covered with buffalo by the millions, fuel was rarely far away. Collecting buffalo chips became a daily chore for children in pioneer families, and a good pile of chips was as valuable as a cord of wood. Sagebrush. Mesquite and other desert plants had their own burning characteristics. Mesquite made excellent coals that burned hot and long, ideal for cooking and overnight fires. Sagebrush burned fast and hot, good for boiling water quickly, but useless for sustained warmth. Greasewood was avoided when possible, as it popped and threw sparks so violently it could set clothing or bedrolls on fire. The amount of firewood needed for a night was always more than beginners expected. A fire that looked substantial at sunset could burn down to nothing within a couple hours. Experienced campers gathered at least twice as much wood as they thought they'd need, piling it close enough to reach without getting up, but far enough from the fire to be safe. Positioning relative to wind was crucial. The fire needed to be sheltered enough that wind didn't blow it out or send smoke into faces and bedrolls, but not so sheltered that it couldn't get oxygen. A fire pit dug slightly below ground level helped protect flames from wind while also containing sparks and embers. The fire also needed to be positioned relative to the bedroll in a way that balanced warmth against safety. Too close, and sparks could burn holes in blankets or, worse, set them ablaze with the sleeper inside. Too far, and the fire's warmth wouldn't reach the bedroll effectively. Most cowboys settled on about 6 to 8 feet as ideal, close enough to feel strong heat, far enough to be safe. Safety wasn't just about distance. The area around the fire had to be cleared of dry grass, leaves, and other flammable material. Many a frontier fire got out of control because it spread through dry vegetation, threatening camp, horses, and lives. A cleared circle about 10 feet in diameter around the fire pit was standard practice. Water or dirt needed to be close at hand for emergencies. A bucket of water, if water was plentiful, sat near the fire at all times. In dry country, a pile of loose dirt served the same purpose, ready to be thrown on flames if they got out of control. The fire's role in predator protection couldn't be overstated. Wolves, mountain lions, and bears were all naturally wary of fire. A well-maintained fire through the night formed a protective circle of light and heat that most animals wouldn't cross. This is why the night watch, the person who stayed awake to tend the fire and watch for danger, was so critical. Night watches were typically divided into shifts among members of a group, with each person responsible for 2 or 3 hours. The watch's duties were clear. Keep the fire burning at a steady level, neither so high that it wasted fuel, nor so low that it invited predators. Listen for unusual sounds. Watch the horses, as they'd often react to approaching danger before human senses detected it. And stay awake no matter how tired, because falling asleep on watch could get everyone killed. Staying awake during a night watch was harder than it sounds. After a long day of riding, working, or walking, exhaustion pulled at your eyelids with almost physical force. Experienced hands developed tricks. Some paced quietly around the camp. Others did minor tasks, sharpening knives, mending tack, or sorting supplies. Many found that keeping a pot of coffee heating on the fire's edge helped, though too much coffee brought its own problems in the form of a painfully full bladder with nowhere to go but the dangerous darkness beyond the firelight. The rhythm of feeding the fire became meditative. Every half hour or so, a log needed to be added, rolled into place with a stick to avoid burned hands. The fire had to be red, understood. Flames that burned blue might indicate damp wood. Red flames were normal. White flames suggested very dry, hot, burning wood. The color and behavior of the smoke told stories, too. Thick white smoke meant green or wet wood. Thin gray smoke was ideal. Black smoke might indicate the fire had found something that shouldn't be burning, perhaps a piece of treated lumber or something with chemical residue. Sparks rising from the fire were mesmerizing, but also informative. Excessive sparking meant resinous wood or wood that was too dry. The path of the sparks showed the wind direction and strength. A sudden change in spark pattern could indicate a shift in the wind, warning of changing weather. The sound of the fire was part of the experience too, the snap and crackle of burning wood, the occasional pop as a pocket of resin exploded, the steady sigh of flames consuming fuel. These sounds became a lullaby for frontier sleepers, as natural and necessary as the darkness itself. But firecraft went beyond just keeping flames alive. Knowing how to bank a fire for the night, covering it with ash and a large log so it would burn slowly and be easy to restart in the morning, was essential knowledge. A properly banked fire could keep coals alive for 6 or 8 hours, making morning fire starting much easier, and in the morning. Blowing on those coals, adding the finest tinder, coaxing the fire back to life with cold fingers and in the pre-dawn chill. This was an art form practiced every single morning by those who lived under the stars. The fire was never just flames. It was a companion, a guardian, a lifeline connecting the human world to the wild darkness that surrounded it. Around the fire, stories were told, meals were shared, and the business of living was conducted. The fire's light carved out a small circle of home in an endless landscape, a place where for a few hours warmth and safety could be found. As the night deepened and the stars wheeled overhead, the fire's glow became more precious, more necessary. It was the beating heart of every camp, the center around which the bedroll, the night watch, the horses, everything else orbited. To let the fire die was to surrender to the darkness, to accept vulnerability in a land that punished the careless and unprepared, and so the fire burned through the night. Tended by watchful hands fed with carefully hoarded fuel, a defiant spark of warmth in the vast, cold, beautiful expanse of the frontier night. Chapter 4. The Art of Sleeping Clothed. One of the most fundamental differences between sleep in the Wild West and sleep in a modern bed is this. In the frontier, you almost never undressed for bed. The very idea of putting on special sleeping clothes and getting under covers would have seemed not just impractical, but dangerously foolish to most cowboys, pioneers, and frontier travelers. The reasons for this were simple and absolute. Night on the frontier was unpredictable. Threats could appear without warning: a stampede, a predator, a raiding party, a sudden storm, fire, or any number of other emergencies. When danger came, there was no time to dress. You needed to be able to roll out of your bedroll and be ready to move, to fight, to run immediately. But sleeping fully clothed wasn't as simple as it might sound. The same clothes that protected you during the day could become instruments of misery at night if not managed properly. Understanding the layering system, knowing what to loosen, what to remove, and what to adjust. This was knowledge that separated a restful night from hours of uncomfortable tossing and turning. The base layer, worn against the skin, was typically wool or cotton long underwear. In an age before modern synthetics, natural fibers were the only option. Wool, as mentioned before, was king for cold weather. It insulated even when damp, didn't hold odor as badly as other materials, and was durable enough to withstand weeks of constant wear. These long johns, as they came to be called, covered from neck to ankle and wrist. They fit relatively tight, which helped trap body heat. At night, most men kept these on, as removing them meant exposing bare skin to cold air and insects. The trick was making sure they weren't too tight, as restricted circulation could lead to cold feet and hands. no matter how many blankets you piled on. Over the long underwear came a shirt, usually wool or heavy cotton flannel. Cowboys favored dark colors, grays, browns, blacks, as these hid dirt and didn't show sweat stains as obviously. The shirt needed to be loose enough to allow movement, but not so loose that it caught on brush or saddle. At night, the top button or two might be loosened to prevent the collar from feeling strangling, but the shirt stayed on. Pants were always kept on, no exceptions. Leather chaps, if worn during the day, were removed before sleeping, as they were stiff, heavy, and uncomfortable to lie on. But the canvas or wool pants underneath stayed put. The belt was often loosened a notch or two, enough to make breathing easier while lying down, but not so loose that the pants might slip. A man needed to be able to stand up and have his pants stay on without fumbling with buttons in the dark. Vests were a matter of personal preference. Some men kept them on for the extra layer of warmth and the pockets that held essential items, matches, a knife, perhaps tobacco. Others removed them, folding them carefully and using them as a pillow or tucking them into the bedroll where they'd stay dry. Boots were the subject of much debate among frontiersmen. Some insisted on keeping them on all night, laced tight. Their reasoning was sound. If you had to run or ride in an emergency, bare feet or even sock feet could be crippling. Stepping on a cactus spine, a sharp rock, or a patch of burning coals could turn a capable man into a liability instantly. But boots on all night had serious downsides. Feet swelled during the day, and tight boots that felt fine while walking became vices of discomfort when lying down. They trapped heat and moisture, leading to blisters and foot rot on long journeys. They were heavy and made rolling over in the night awkward. And perhaps worst of all, they carried the day's accumulation of mud, manure, and dust directly into the bedroll. The compromise most experienced cowboys reached was this. Boots were loosened significantly, laces pulled almost entirely out or buckles undone, and positioned within arm's reach, but technically removed. This way, feet could breathe and circulation could recover through the night, but the boots could be jammed back on in seconds if needed. Some men tied a string from their boot to their wrist, ensuring they couldn't lose track of them in the dark. Socks presented their own challenges. Damp socks were worse than no socks at all, stealing heat and creating conditions for blisters and fungal infections. The evening routine for many cowboys included checking their socks. If they were damp from sweat, they were changed if a spare pair was available, or removed and draped near the fire to dry if no spare existed. In very cold weather, completely dry socks might be pulled on just before sleeping, kept warm and fresh, specifically for night use. Hats, that most iconic piece of Western wear, served important functions at night. A hat could shield the face from dew, which fell surprisingly heavy in many parts of the West. It could be positioned to block firelight if a man was trying to sleep near the blaze. It could be used as a pillow, stuffed with grass or spare clothes to soften it. Most importantly, it marked a man's spot. A hat on or near a bedroll signaled that this sleeping space was occupied, helping prevent others from stumbling over a sleeping person in the dark. The neckerchief, or bandana, another Western staple, was kept close at night. During the day, it protected against sun, dust, and cold. At night, it could be used as an extra layer around the neck, a face covering against blowing sand, a makeshift bandage, a water filter, or any number of other emergency uses. Many cowboys slept with their bandana tied loosely around their neck, ready for whatever the night might bring. Gloves were typically removed for sleeping, as the hands needed to breathe and recover from the day's hard use. But like boots, they were kept close, tucked into a pocket, slipped into the bedroll near the chest, or positioned where they could be grabbed quickly. Gloves were too valuable to risk losing in the dark. In cold weather, additional layers came into play. A coat or jacket might be kept on, though usually unbuttoned to prevent overheating. Some men slept in their coats but pulled their arms out of the sleeves, using the coat as an additional blanket layer while keeping it ready to be fully worn in an instant. The gun belt deserved special consideration. Most frontiersmen slept with their firearms close, often within the bedroll itself. The gun belt, heavy with the weight of pistol and ammunition, was uncomfortable to sleep in. The standard practice was to remove the belt, but position it so the gun was within immediate reach, often right at the level of the pillow where a hand could grasp it without thought. Rifles or other long guns were typically propped against a nearby rock or tree, or laid flat alongside the bedroll, again positioned for instant access. Some cowboys slept with a rifle actually in the bedroll, though this was uncomfortable, and most considered it unnecessary, unless the threat level was extremely high. The art of sleeping clothed extended beyond just what you wore. It involved understanding how your body temperature would change through the night. In the desert, where temperatures might drop 40 degrees between sunset and dawn, you might go to sleep comfortable, but wake up shivering if you hadn't planned ahead. Experienced sleepers learn to anticipate this. They might put on an extra layer before sleeping, even if they felt too warm initially, knowing their body temperature would drop as they slept and the air continued to cool. They positioned blankets within easy reach so they could pull them up without fully waking. They learned to sleep curled slightly, reducing surface area and conserving heat, rather than sprawled out. Moisture management was another critical aspect. A man working hard all day in the sun would sweat, and that sweat would soak into his clothing. If those damp clothes were worn into the bedroll, the moisture would evaporate through the night, stealing heat in the process. This was how people got sick, how pneumonia and other respiratory illnesses took hold. The evening routine, therefore, often included a period near the fire to dry out. Sitting close to the flames, perhaps with your back to the heat, allowed the day's accumulated moisture to evaporate while you were still generating body heat. This made a tremendous difference in comfort through the night. For those who could manage it, a change of clothes before sleeping was ideal. A fresh, dry shirt kept specifically for sleeping could transform the quality of rest. But most cowboys and pioneers couldn't afford to carry extra clothes, and those they had needed to last months or even years. So they made do, using the techniques they'd learned to maximize comfort with minimal resources. Children and women, when present on the frontier, faced additional challenges with nighttime clothing. Long skirts and dresses were impractical for sleeping in emergencies, yet social conventions of the time made wearing pants scandalous for most women. Some frontier women adopted the practical solution of wearing split skirts or even men's pants at night, keeping them hidden under their bedrolls but ready if needed. Children, particularly in pioneer families, were often dressed in the warmest clothes available at night, as their smaller bodies lost heat more quickly. Mothers wrapped their youngest in layers that might seem excessive, but which could mean the difference between a healthy child and one who sickened from the cold. Native peoples had their own sophisticated clothing systems for sleep. Many tribes wore garments specifically designed to transition from day to night use, with fastenings that could be loosened for comfort, while keeping the garment secure. Leather clothing had the advantage of blocking wind effectively while being relatively easy to adjust. Fur-lined garments worn with the fur against the skin provided exceptional warmth without excessive bulk. The integration of Native American clothing wisdom with European settler practices created hybrid systems that worked remarkably well. Wool blankets used as both clothing and bedding, leather items that served multiple purposes, fur linings in strategic locations. These combinations represented the practical blending of survival knowledge from different cultures. There were also psychological aspects to sleeping clothed that shouldn't be overlooked. Being dressed provided a sense of security, a readiness. The vulnerability of being unclothed, which we accept without thought in our climate-controlled bedrooms, would have been intolerable to people living with constant low-level danger. The simple act of being dressed helped people sleep more soundly, paradoxically, because they felt prepared for anything. The flip side was that sleeping fully clothed could be uncomfortable in ways that accumulated over time. Seams in shirts and pants pressed against skin in the same spots night after night, creating sore points. Fabric that bunched while lying down could cut off circulation. Buttons and buckles poked uncomfortably. The inability to fully stretch out and relax meant that sleep, while necessary, was often not as restorative as it could have been, this constant mild discomfort, combined with the hard ground, the cold or heat. The need to maintain vigilance meant that frontier sleep was fundamentally different from modern sleep. It was lighter, more broken, more reactive. People learned to function on less sleep and lower quality sleep than we would consider adequate today. But they also developed techniques to maximize what rest they could get. Positioning the body correctly, with the spine straight rather than twisted, made a surprising difference. Learning to relax muscles consciously, starting with the feet and moving up the body, helped achieve deeper rest even when conditions were far from ideal. Mental techniques, focusing on breath or running through familiar memories, helped quiet the mind despite the unfamiliar sounds and sensations of sleeping outdoors. As the frontier night deepened and the clothed sleepers settled into their bedrolls, they existed in a state between civilization and wilderness. Their clothing connected them to the towns and homes they'd left behind, the stitches and fabric representing human craft and culture. But the way they wore that clothing, adapted and adjusted for survival, showed their integration into the harsh realities of the Western landscape. The fully dressed sleeper, gun within reach, boots nearby, ready to stand and move at a moment's notice, represented the fundamental truth of frontier life. You were never entirely safe, never fully at rest, never able to completely let your guard down. But within those constraints, through accumulated knowledge and careful practice, you could find enough rest to wake in the morning, ready to face another day in the unforgiving beauty of the Wild West. Chapter 5. Water, Food, and the Evening Ritual. As a darkness settled over the frontier camp and thoughts turned toward sleep, there was work yet to be done. The evening ritual, those hours between the end of the day's travel and the moment of finally lying down, involved a series of tasks that would determine not just the comfort of the night ahead, but the capability to face the next day. Water was always the first concern. If camp was near a source, whether river, stream, spring, or waterhole, the evening was when containers were filled for the night and the following morning. Drinking water, cooking water, water for washing if such luxury was possible, all had to be fetched before full darkness made the trip to the water source dangerous. But not all water was safe. The pristine streams we imagine when we think of the Old West were often anything but. Upstream, there might be a dead animal. The water might be contaminated with minerals that could cause dysentery. Beaver ponds, while often the only water available, could harbor giardia and other parasites that would leave a man weak and dehydrated for days. Experienced travelers knew how to judge water quality. Fast-flowing water over rocks was generally safer than stagnant pools. Water that animals drank from was usually safe, though you'd want to take your water upstream, from where the animals waded in. Clear water wasn't always clean, and murky water wasn't always unsafe, but given a choice, you took the clearest water available. Boiling was the surest way to make water safe, and much of the water consumed in camp was boiled either for coffee or tea, or simply boiled and allowed to cool. This required fuel and time, both of which were often in short supply, so many people drank water straight from the source and took their chances. Those who survived learned which waters were trustworthy. The cooking fire was distinct from the warming fire in many camps. A smaller fire, with wood arranged for maximum heat and minimum smoke, was used for preparing the evening meal. Timing was important. Food needed to be cooked and eaten before full darkness, both because cooking by firelight alone was difficult and because meals were one of the few times people's attention was diverted from watching for danger. The frontier diet was not diverse. For cowboys on a trail drive, the menu was famously monotonous: beans, bacon, coffee, and biscuits, day after day after day. The beans were usually pinto beans, cooked in a heavy cast iron pot that hung over the fire or nestled in the coals. They'd been soaking since morning, carried in a watertight container on the chuck wagon, or packed on a mule. The bacon was salt pork, incredibly fatty by modern standards, but that fat was vital. It provided concentrated calories and made the otherwise bland beans edible. The The grease was saved and used for everything from frying to waterproofing leather to treating saddle sores on horses. Biscuits, or trail bread as it was sometimes called, were made from flour, salt, and water, with bacon grease or lard mixed in. The dough was formed into rough rounds and either baked in a Dutch oven, buried in coals, or wrapped around a stick and toasted over the fire. When properly made, they were filling and lasted well. When poorly made, they were hard enough to use as weapons, leading to the nickname sinkers. Coffee was not just a beverage, but a survival tool. It helped men stay alert during night watches. It provided warmth in cold weather. It was a social ritual that brought the group together. The frontier coffee was strong enough to float a horseshoe, as the saying went, boiled in a pot with grounds that settled, usually, to the bottom. Some cowboys added eggshells to clarify the coffee. Others just poured carefully and accepted that the last few sips would be gritty. Pioneers and homesteaders had more varied diets when they could manage it. Gardens provided vegetables in season. Chickens offered eggs. Hunting added game meat, venison, rabbit, wild turkey, or whatever could be shot. But the reality was that most frontier meals were simple, heavy on starches and fats, light on fresh vegetables and fruits. The evening meal was preparation for night's fast. Your body would go 10 or 12 hours without food, burning calories to stay warm through the cold hours. Eating well in the evening, particularly foods high in fat and protein, helped fuel that nighttime metabolic work. Going to bed hungry meant a cold, miserable night, as your body lacked the fuel to generate heat. After eating came the minimal washing that frontier life allowed. Water was too precious to waste on elaborate bathing, and the cold made washing anything but a necessity anyway. But at minimum, hands and face were wiped clean, both for comfort and to avoid attracting insects and predators to your bedroll with food smells. Teeth were sometimes cleaned with a frayed twig used as a brush or simply rinsed with water. Dental hygiene was poor by modern standards, but those who maintained what care they could had better health than those who neglected it entirely. The condition of feet received particular attention in the evening. After a day of walking or riding, feet were often blistered, sore, or showing the early signs of problems that could become serious. Removing boots and socks, examining feet by firelight, treating hot spots with whatever was available. A bit of tallow, a scrap of soft cloth, clean socks if you had them. This could prevent minor irritations from becoming injuries that made walking impossible. For those who'd been riding, the evening also meant checking your horse. Feed and water for the horse often took priority over your own meal, because a healthy horse was your transportation, your escape route, and sometimes your early warning system. The horse was rubbed down, checked for injuries, and either hobbled or picketed where it could graze. A horse that bolted in the night could leave you stranded hundreds of miles from anywhere. A death sentence on the frontier. Saddles and tack were checked and maintained. Leather that had gotten wet was dried and treated with neat's foot oil or rendered fat to keep it supple. Girths and reins were inspected for wear. A broken strap at a critical moment could mean a fall, an injury, or worse. This maintenance, done by firelight with tired hands, was as important as any other survival task. Personal weapons received the same careful attention. Firearms were cleaned, especially if they had been used that day or exposed to dust and moisture. Black powder residue was corrosive and could ruin a gun if left uncleaned. The ritual of disassembling, cleaning, and reassembling a pistol or rifle was meditative, a quiet task that allowed the mind to settle after the day's exertions. Ammunition was checked. Was there enough? Were the cartridges dry? In the days of paper cartridges and percussion caps, moisture was the enemy. Even with metallic cartridges, which became common after the Civil War, a visual inspection could reveal a split case or other defect that might cause a misfire when you needed the gun most. Knives were sharpened. A dull knife was more dangerous than a sharp one, requiring more force and more likely to slip and cause injury. A whetstone was standard equipment, and the evening fire provided enough light to properly sharpen a blade. The rasping sound of steel on stone was as much a part of the evening soundscape as the crackle of the fire. This evening work served multiple purposes. Practically, it ensured readiness for the next day and the night ahead. Psychologically, it provided a transition period between the activity of the day and the relative passivity of night. The familiar tasks, performed in the same order evening after evening, created a sense of routine and normalcy in an environment that was anything but routine or normal. For groups traveling together, the evening was also social time. Stories were told, news shared, plans discussed. The isolation of frontier life made these social interactions precious. A stranger arriving in camp would be questioned for news of the outside world, of conditions on the trail ahead, of dangers to avoid or opportunities to seek. Songs were common, though quieter than Hollywood would have you believe. Loud singing carried far in the still night air and could attract unwanted attention, but soft singing, quiet harmonies around the fire provided comfort and helped pass the time. Many of the songs were melancholy, speaking of homes left behind, loved ones not seen in months or years, the hardships of the trail. The evening was also when night watches were assigned, if the group was large enough to rotate them. In a party of 4, each man might take 3 hours of watch. Larger groups could allow shorter shifts. The watch rotation was discussed and agreed upon, ensuring everyone knew when they'd be woken and who they were relieving. As the evening tasks were completed, one by one, the camp settled. Conversation quieted. The fire was built up for the night or banked down depending on the situation and fuel supply. Men began to unroll their bedrolls, positioning them in the spots they'd chosen earlier. There was often a final check of the perimeter, a walk around the camp looking outward into the darkness, listening for unusual sounds, ensuring that nothing was immediately threatening. This was partly practical and partly ritual, a last assertion of control over the small circle of light and warmth before surrendering to sleep. Before lying down, many men took a moment to look at the sky. The stars in the frontier west were spectacular in ways that modern light pollution has made almost impossible to imagine. The Milky Way blazed overhead, a river of light spanning the entire sky. Constellations that are faint to us were vivid to them. The moon, when present, cast enough light to see by, turning the landscape into a black and white photograph. Reading the sky was practical too. Weather prediction, crude but often accurate, came from observing cloud patterns, the color of the sunset, the clarity of the stars. A ring around the moon meant rain within a day or two. Certain cloud formations promised storms. A blood-red sunset could mean high winds coming. The moment of finally lying down, after all the day's work and the evening's preparations, was both relief and vulnerability. Relief because the body could finally rest. Vulnerability because in sleep you were at your most defenseless. This is why all the preparation mattered. Why the careful choice of campsite, the maintenance of equipment, the positioning of weapons, the tending of the fire, all of it came together to create enough security that sleep became possible. As the frontier sleeper pulled the blankets up, adjusted the canvas against the wind, and settled into the position that would be maintained, more or less through the night, there was often a moment of conscious gratitude. Gratitude for having survived another day, for having food in the belly and a fire to keep away the cold, for companions to share the watch, for the vast, dangerous, beautiful landscape that had become, for better or worse, home. And then, finally, sleep came. Not all at once, but gradually, as the adrenaline of the day faded, as the warmth of the fire and the bedroll soaked in, as exhaustion claimed its due. The sleep was never complete unconsciousness, never the deep oblivion of a safe, quiet bedroom. It was frontier sleep, one ear always listening, one part of the mind always monitoring, ready to wake at the wrong sound, the warning call, the change in the fire's crackle that meant something was wrong, but it was rest, precious and necessary. The pause that allowed the body and mind to recover enough to do it all again tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, for as long as the journey lasted or the frontier demanded. Chapter 6. The Sounds and Dangers of Darkness. The night on the frontier was never silent. To modern ears, accustomed to the hum of electricity and the distant sound of traffic, The frontier night might seem quiet, but to those who lived in it, the darkness was full of sound. A complex symphony that required constant interpretation. Each sound had meaning. The challenge was knowing which sounds were normal and which signaled danger. This knowledge came only through experience, through countless nights of listening, learning, and occasionally being proven wrong in terrifying ways. The wind was perhaps the most constant sound, and it could mask everything else. In the Great Plains, wind howled ceaselessly, rattling whatever was loose, finding gaps in canvas, making bedrolls flutter. The sound was maddening at first, but veterans learned to tune it out, to hear other sounds through it. They learned to tell the difference between wind moving through grass and wind moving through brush, between wind around rocks and wind through trees. Coyotes were among the most common night sounds, their yipping and howling carrying for miles across open country. To greenhorns, coyote calls were terrifying, suggesting packs of savage beasts closing in. Experienced hands knew better. Coyotes were generally cowards where humans were concerned. Their calls were about communication within their packs, establishing territory, coordinating hunts for rabbits and rodents. A coyote howl was normal. Its absence, sudden silence where there should be sound, that was when you worried. Wolves were different. Wolf howls were deeper, more sustained, more purposeful. Wolves were larger, bolder, and far more dangerous than coyotes. A wolf pack on the move was something to take seriously. The horses knew the difference too. They might ignore coyotes, but would show clear agitation at wolf sounds, ears forward, bodies tense, ready to bolt if not carefully secured. Mountain lions, when present, were terrifyingly silent. They rarely vocalized, and when they did, the sound was unlike anything else. A woman's scream, sudden and chilling. Many a frontier campfire conversation included stories of that scream cutting through the night, freezing blood and sending hands to weapons. Mountain lions were ambush predators, solitary and careful. The terrifying reality was that if a mountain lion wanted you, you usually wouldn't hear it until too late. Bears made various sounds depending on species and situation. Black bears could be noisy, crashing through brush, grunting, and huffing. Grizzlies were quieter despite their size, capable of moving with surprising stealth. Both were generally avoided, and a camp that detected bear signs moved if at all possible. Bears were unpredictable, powerful enough to kill a man with a single swipe, and motivated by hunger that made them willing to challenge humans for food. Smaller predators, foxes, bobcats, badgers, announced themselves with their own repertoire of sounds. Foxes made strange barking sounds. Bobcats had a scratchy yowl. Badgers, if disturbed, hissed and snarled with surprising aggression for their size. Learning these sounds, cataloging them, understanding what they meant about what animals were nearby and what they were doing, was essential education for frontier sleepers. Prey animals made noise too. Deer crashing through brush could sound alarmingly large. Rabbits, when caught by predators, screamed in a way that sounded disturbingly human. Mice and rats rustled constantly, investigating camps for crumbs and attracting the predators that hunted them. The sound of small animals fighting or fleeing often preceded the appearance of whatever was chasing them, providing seconds of warning. Birds, though mostly quiet at night, contributed to the soundscape. Owls hooted, their calls varying by species. Nighthawks and poorwills made their characteristic sounds. The sudden alarm call of a roosting bird often indicated a predator passing beneath. Waterfowl on nearby ponds or streams would erupt in protest if disturbed, their calls carrying clearly in the still night air. Insects provided a constant background hum in warmer months. Crickets, cicadas, katydids, each had their own rhythm and frequency. Experienced listeners could tell the temperature by cricket chirps, counting the number in a 15-second period and adding a constant. More importantly, the sudden silencing of insect noise meant something had disturbed them, and that something might be a predator, a human intruder, or approaching weather. Weather itself had sounds. The distant rumble of thunder gave warning of approaching storms, sometimes hours in advance. Wind patterns changed as fronts moved through, the sound shifting from steady to gusty. Rain could be heard coming across the landscape, the hiss growing louder as it approached. Hail sounded like distant applause at first, then like drumming as it grew close. Geological sounds were part of the night, too. In areas with cliffs and canyons, rocks fell, their clattering descent carrying clearly. Hot rocks contracting as they cooled made popping and cracking sounds. In the rare areas with geothermal activity, steam vents hissed and bubbled through the night. Human sounds were carefully monitored because they could mean anything from friendly travelers to hostile raiders. The jingle of tack, the creak of leather, the murmur of voices, the clink of metal on metal, all carried farther than people expected. A good night watcher could detect an approaching group long before they came into view, giving critical time to prepare a welcome or a defense. The sounds of your own camp had to be distinguished from external sounds. Horses shifting, stamping, or feeding made constant noise. The fire popped and crackled. Canvas fluttered. Sleepers snored, rolled over, or muttered in their sleep. These familiar sounds formed a baseline against which unusual sounds stood out. Learning to sleep through normal sounds while remaining alert for abnormal ones was a skill that took time to develop. The brain had to be trained to filter, to ignore the constant white noise of wind and insects while reacting instantly to the snap of a twig or the low growl of a predator. This selective attention was exhausting, one reason why frontier sleep was rarely as restful as sleep in safer circumstances. The acoustic properties of different landscapes affected how sound traveled. In canyons, echoes confused direction and distance. Open plains allowed sounds to carry for miles but made it hard to pinpoint sources. Forests muffled some sounds while amplifying others. Experienced travelers factored these properties into their assessment of threats, knowing that what sounded close in a canyon might be far away, or that what seemed distant on the plains might be dangerously near. Weather conditions affected sound transmission too. Cold, still air carried sound extremely well. Warm days followed by cold nights created temperature inversions that could channel sound in unexpected ways. High humidity could muffle sounds. Strong winds could make it impossible to hear anything not immediately close. The psychological aspect of night sounds shouldn't be underestimated. The human mind, alone in darkness, tends toward fear. Unknown sounds become magnified, interpreted as threats. Imagination fills in details that senses don't actually provide. A branch scraping a rock becomes footsteps. Wind through a hollow becomes breathing. The distant cry of an animal becomes something pursuing you. Experienced frontier hands learn to manage this tendency, to remain calm, to assess rationally rather than panicking. They developed mental frameworks. I know what coyotes sound like. That's a coyote. I'm not in danger. This conscious categorization of sounds helped maintain psychological equilibrium through the long night hours. But sometimes the sounds really did mean danger. Sometimes the rustling in the brush was a bear. Sometimes the whispered voices were raiders. Sometimes the changing wind brought the smell of smoke from a prairie fire still miles away, but moving fast. The trick was being able to tell the difference, and even the most experienced hands got it wrong sometimes. When genuine danger announced itself, the response had to be swift. A shout to wake the camp, hands reaching for weapons, bodies rolling out of bedrolls and into defensive positions. All of this happened faster than thought, driven by adrenaline and trained reflex. This was why sleeping clothed, with weapons close, mattered. In the seconds between detecting threat and responding to it, survival was decided. The night watch played a critical role in managing these sounds. The person awake while others slept bore the responsibility of interpretation and decision. Should a sound be investigated or ignored? Should the camp be woken or allowed to sleep? These judgment calls had consequences. Wake everyone for a false alarm too many times, and they'd stop taking your warnings seriously. Miss a real threat, and people could die. The tools available to the night watch were limited. A torch could be made by wrapping cloth around a stick and soaking it in grease or oil, then lighting it from the fire. This provided light to investigate sounds, but also made the bearer a target and destroyed their night vision. More often, the watch relied on hearing and the dim light from the fire and moon. Dogs, when present, were invaluable for night security. Their hearing was far superior to humans, and they'd alert to approaching animals or people long before human ears detected anything. Many frontier travelers brought dogs specifically for this purpose, accepting the additional burden of feeding them for the security they provided. A good dog could distinguish between normal sounds and threats, reducing false alarms while ensuring genuine dangers didn't go unnoticed. Horses also served as sentries in a way. They'd react to predators or approaching humans, their body language readable, even in dim light. A horse that suddenly raised its head, ears forward, staring into the darkness, was detecting something. Whether that something was dangerous or merely interesting required further assessment, but the horse's reaction provided a starting point. As the night progressed and the watcher's shift neared its end, fatigue became an enemy. Sounds started to blend together. Attention wavered. This was the most dangerous time when mistakes were most likely. The watch needed to actively fight against drowsiness, walking around camp splashing cold water on the face, doing anything to stay alert until relief arrived. When the watch changed, there was a brief conversation, usually whispered to avoid waking others. Quiet night. Heard coyotes west of camp. One of the horses seems nervous. This information transfer ensured continuity, helped the new watcher know what to focus on, what was already known, and what still needed monitoring. As dawn approached and the first gray light began to seep into the eastern sky, the sounds changed again. Nocturnal animals returned to their dens. Diurnal creatures began stirring. Birds started their morning calls. The shift from night to day was gradual but distinct, and it brought a sense of relief to those who'd spent the dark hours awake or half awake, listening to every sound and wondering which might signal danger. The sounds of the frontier night were a language, complex and subtle, requiring ears to fully learn. But those who mastered this language, who could distinguish between the meaningless and the meaningful, who could sleep through the harmless while remaining alert to the harmful, gained an enormous survival advantage. They could rest when rest was possible and react when reaction was necessary, walking the knife edge between paranoia and carelessness that defined success on the frontier. Chapter 7. The Morning After. The transition from night to morning on the frontier was gradual and, in its own way, as carefully orchestrated as the evening routine. The first hints of dawn came long before actual sunrise, a subtle lightening of the eastern sky that experienced travelers learned to recognize even in deep sleep. The last night watch. Whoever drew that duty was responsible for the transition. As the sky began to lighten, they'd build up the fire, adding fresh wood to create flames and heat that would welcome the waking camp. The smell of smoke and burning wood, the sound of crackling fire, these became the camp's alarm clock, gentle but insistent. Coffee was started before anyone else was fully awake. Water from the previous evening, hopefully not frozen despite being kept near the fire, went into the pot. Grounds were added liberally, a handful or more depending on the size of the pot and the taste preferences of the group. The pot was set directly on the coals or suspended over the flames, and within minutes the smell of brewing coffee joined the smoke scent. This smell was powerful. For people who'd spent the night in the cold, who'd slept uncomfortably on hard ground, who faced another long day of difficult travel, that first cup of hot coffee was something close to salvation. It represented warmth, caffeine, to combat fatigue, and the psychological comfort of a familiar ritual. As the coffee brewed, sleepers began to stir. The process was gradual. A hand might emerge from the bedroll, testing the air temperature. A head might lift, looking around to confirm location and assess the weather. Then, reluctantly but inevitably, the full emergence from the warm cocoon of blankets into the cold morning air. This moment was one of the hardest of the entire frontier experience. The bedroll, after hours of body heat, was warm. The air outside was cold, often painfully so. Every instinct said to burrow deeper, to stay in the warmth just a little longer. But day was coming, work needed to be done, miles needed to be covered. So you forced yourself out, gasping at the cold, reaching immediately for boots, for hat, for whatever outer layer would provide protection against the chill. The first priority for most was moving close to the fire, hands extended toward flames, seeking warmth, feet positioned to feel radiated heat. The fire was ringed with people, all facing inward, all trying to get warm before the day's work began. Coffee was distributed. Tin cups, warm to the touch, filled with a dark, strong brew. The first sip, carefully taken to avoid burning the mouth, seemed to spread warmth through the entire body. It was psychological as much as physical, but the effect was real. After that first cup, the day seemed manageable. Breakfast was simple, often just leftover biscuits from the night before, or perhaps a quick batch of fried bacon and more coffee. The priority was calories and speed. The day wasn't going to wait, and every minute spent in camp was a minute not traveling. On trail drives, the boss would be anxious to get moving. Animals didn't herd themselves. As food was consumed and coffee drank, the camp began its morning dismantling. Bedrolls were shaken out, aired briefly if time allowed, then rolled tight and tied. The process was the reverse of the previous evening's setup. Each layer rolled inside the next until the whole thing formed a manageable bundle again.